everyone, and welcome to the continued presentation on Introduction to Policy Analysis. We are in week 8, and this is part 2 of the 3-part video series on the design of the delivery system. The content here is from the Dimensions of Social Welfare Policy by Gilbert and Terrell. In the first part of the video series, I went over the different dimensions of choice that are part of the design of the delivery system. We ended on privatization, and I wanted to go a little bit more into detail on what that means and the implications for social work. So let's start with the definition of privatization. And actually, there are many different definitions, and this information is from the source below here. So one way to think of privatization is complete government withdrawal from a function. So it involves contracting out to a private entity. So in this case, when we're talking about social work, it's the government deciding that they are no longer going to provide a particular service, let's say child welfare, public child welfare, and a private organization is going to take over that entire system. It could also refer to use of vouchers to allow clients to quote unquote shop around. So this is where the government has not completely withdrawn, but it allows clients to have a certain level of choice in going to a private agency versus going to them. Another definition involves the extent of competition among agencies rather than whether a public or private entity provides the services. Yet another definition is that there should be a distinction between government contracts with nonprofit organizations and those with for-profit organizations. So it's not just the distinction between public and private, but within private as well. Others say, no, this is not the way to go when defining privatization, that actually for-profit and nonprofit organizations subcontract with each other. So it's really hard at the end of the day to say, for example, what outcomes were due to private versus, due to for-profit versus nonprofit entities providing the services. So for our purposes, privatization is going to refer to government or public agencies contracting out services to provide to private entities. I've been using the word provide and provider and services too much. Okay, so this can be in the form of vouchers, it can be in the form of contracting out an entire system, etc. It's just the government entering into some sort of relationship with a private entity in order for that private entity to provide services. Now, privatization is not something that is new in public services. In fact, before the New Deal era, most social services were delivered by private organizations, religious or otherwise. And sometimes these organizations received public subsidies to care for what were termed needy people. So these are public funds being given to private organizations. So this is privatization, although it should be noted that the level of funds varied greatly. After the Great Depression, the government's role in funding private social services began to increase, although it was still fairly limited. And then during the 60s and 70s, and we'll talk about this, federal funding for social services increased overall. In general, there was an increase, but a big portion actually did go to private entities as well. So that by 1971, 25% of state spending on social services was for what was called purchased services. So that's another way of saying privatization. By 1976, it was 49%. And these data are from this particular study cited here. In a 1993 study, about 80% of the states surveyed reported that in the previous 5 years, they had increased their use of privatized social services. But this is really nothing compared to the last 2 decades, where we've seen this interest on privatization expanding to areas such as Medicare and welfare and child welfare, just different sort of whole entire systems. And so we have to ask, why is this a major trend toward privatization when it comes to Medicare and welfare and whole systems? I'm going to specifically touch on welfare here as an example. So back when TANF was AFDC, there was a lot of frustration with that system. Aid to Families with Dependent Children is what that stands for, or public assistance for families. So there was this widespread belief that the old AFDC system and the agencies that administered it, namely public agencies, were fundamentally flawed, quote unquote. So it was this a sense that the public agency was geared more toward ensuring eligibility and compliance with rules versus actually helping recipients find work and become self-sufficient. And this was tied to this idea that there was an increasingly bureaucratic system. And so there was a call to change that quote unquote culture of the welfare office. Contractors, private contractors, were seen as being less entrenched in those old ways than public welfare agencies, and privatization was seen as a way to reinvent the welfare system. And part of this reinventing involved the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, or PROWORA, which is otherwise known as welfare reform, that took place in 1996. And it was really PROWORA that provided this impetus to privatize even more in several different ways. First, the newer requirements under PROWORA led states and localities to find new ways to deliver employment services. There were a lot of requirements not only put on the recipients, but also on the states and local levels of government. In addition, PROWORA dropped the requirement that eligibility for cash assistance be determined by public employees. So private agencies could now determine who is going to get assistance and who is not. In addition, there was a change to a fund. There was a change in funding to a block grant system, which we'll go over in more detail when we go over the source of funding. But for our purposes here, just know that it's the states being given a set amount with very little strings attached. Anyway, so this change led to more discretion for the states. So some felt like they lacked capacity to meet the new requirements, so contracting out allowed them to quote unquote buy this new capacity and come up to speed quickly. Also, it was very flexible to them because they could get rid of this additional capacity if their needs changed. In addition, under PROWORA, there was a quote unquote charitable choice provision, which means that those private entities, some of them could be religious or faith-based organizations. So think about that. They are providing TANF-funded services with no requirements that they remove religious symbols or religious content. Think about the implications of that in terms of accessibility, in terms of comfort, the comfort level of clients who may not be of that particular religious organization, but they need services, and that is the only provider in town. Another service that got privatized, as I mentioned earlier, was eligibility and case management as well. The question then becomes accountability. If private organizations are determining eligibility, who are they being held accountable to? And if it's a religious organization, then we have issues of perhaps discrimination based on those religious tenets. And again, who are they being held accountable to? So what is so good and what is so bad about privatized services? Ultimately, this is what we're wanting to understand in more detail. So there's that issue of cost savings that I mentioned in the previous video as being kind of a sticking point. So the idea here is that competitive, sorry, it's late. Competitive markets lead to cheaper and higher quality goods because consumers can shop around. So this may be the case in our current economic market, but is it the case in social services, in that social service sector? Well, social welfare programs are not in the same type of environment as businesses, and clients are usually not able to judge the quality of providers and then make an informed choice. So this is referred to as contract failure. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that one private service provider is the only game in town, especially in rural areas or places like that. So actually, this leads to the opposite of what is desired, which is lower quality services to reduce costs. So what else is good? Well, there's this belief that private agencies have more capacity and links to getting higher quality staff. We've all heard of high turnover, for example, in public departments, and the idea is that private agencies may be able to recruit and retain higher quality staff. Well, this is not necessarily true. There are many high quality programs that can be provided. I'm sorry, I meant high quality training programs that can be provided in-house or contracted out. So there could be an element of privatization in those training programs for the employees, but it doesn't necessarily mean that public employees cannot be of high quality as well. Then there's this idea about flexibility because private agencies do not have the same collective bargaining unions and contracts, and sometimes those contracts are seen as restrictive and expensive, which I mean, they lead to higher wages for workers, which is not necessarily a bad thing because if you don't have them, then there's kind of room for exploitation of workers. And then lastly, there's this idea that privatization is actually political in nature, not surprising, because it allows policymakers to maintain their distance from the political liabilities that can be associated with government programs. But at the same time, they're satisfying their constituents' demands for a variety of public services. But the problem is if they are sort of wiping their hands clean, if you will, of these services, and who's going to hold those private contractors accountable? This is actually less of an issue these days because there has been a trend toward trying to hold nonprofits and for-profits more accountable, especially, and interestingly enough, not necessarily from the government, but from the other funders that they have, like private foundations and what have you, who are actually wanting more evaluation of programs, which is actually interesting. Another sort of bad thing, if you will, there's no good part of this, but it has to do with for-profit agencies in particular, and what I referred to before in terms of the profit motive. And sometimes some agencies may put that profit motive above helping clients. So in other words, in order to reduce costs, they might provide lower quality services. They might not monitor those services. Again, that issue of accountability as well. This has been a big issue for public child welfare in terms of a state contracting out that entire system. There have been many headlines out there, and this most recent one was about, does privatized foster care put kids at risk? And it's really recent, 2018. And here the tagline is, the number of kids in foster care is climbing, and so are public costs. In search of efficiencies, many states have at least partially privatized their systems. But unfortunately, as time has shown, privatizing entire systems like public child welfare has been putting clients at risk, and in this case, children at risk. For example, a former caseworker says that a child death actually that happened in Florida points out the flaws in a privatized child welfare system. There was another headline about Alexandria Hill, who was a child, called The Brief Life and Private Death of Alexandria Hill. When the government took her from her family, it outsourced her safety to a for-profit corporation. 9 months later, she was dead. And this was a kind of a tipping point for this privatization of child welfare. And since then, there's been attempts at creating policies, legislation to stop this from happening. Both these cases happen to be in Florida, I think, or maybe Alexandria was in Texas. But in any case, this isn't just in Florida or just in a couple states. In fact, as noted in that original article I was citing, over the past 3 decades, many states have privatized at least part of their foster care systems. Some, like Kansas and Florida, have privatized theirs completely. So again, that means that in Kansas and in Florida, their entire public child welfare system is run by a private agency. Despite high-profile cases like Alexandria's, which helped prompt a 2015 Senate Finance Committee investigation that resulted in proposed legislation to strengthen government oversight of foster care, some states and officials continue to see privatization as an antidote to a bloated and inefficient public sector. Kentucky, for instance, recently pledged to investigate whether it should fully privatize its foster care system. Private agencies currently provide services for around half of the children in that state. In Texas, a pilot program that privatizes the monitoring of homes identified as at risk for child abuse or neglect is moving forward despite some lawmakers' concerns. So think about that. Texas is not only has not only privatized its a part of its public child welfare system, but now they're actually trying to privatize monitoring, accountability. It's unbelievable, but okay, so there you have it. Those are the issues around privatization. So this is the end of part 2, and the last one coming up is part 3. I know, shocker, how this all works in consecutive order. But okay, here's the sources of the images I used, and that's it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll go to part 3. Okay, bye.